Hi, and welcome to cloudacademy.com's video series on security, and particularly in relation to AWS, Amazon.com instances. In this video, we'll discuss managing network access, or really controlling your network ports, which are open, which are closed, which offer access to the outside world. We've already discussed in a previous video Amazon's security groups. Let's briefly review what we saw already. Let's click on EC2. Click on Launch Instance. Select a machine, an AMI or an AMI. Configure the instance details down in the bottom right corner. And now, configure security group. That's option number 6 at the top. Let's give a name to this new security group. Say name, that should set it apart from all the others. And let's assign some rules. We'll allow SSH connections, secure shell, SSH stands for secure shell, using the TCP protocol. Amazon knows that SSH uses the TCP protocol through port 22, which is the default SSH port, and coming at this point from anywhere. We could actually choose to restrict access to only my IP or a custom IP, but we'll leave it as anywhere for now. Add one more rule just for illustration. Let's add HTTP access, that is web browser access. Again, Amazon knows that HTTP will access by default through port 80, and we again have the option of choosing what source IP addresses we will allow. Let's review and launch. And although this may not be the most secure security group that exists, it may well work for our purposes. You should also know how to monitor your network configuration from inside your Amazon AWS instance from the command line. The primary tool you'll use to keep track of what's open and available, what's accessible to the outside world, is netstat. You of course should use netstat only as the root user or under sudo. Using netstat without any arguments will display all active sessions in a number of categories. For our purposes right now, this top entry tells us that the local port 172.30.0.223, which is our local address, is open to SSH activity. And right now there is a session coming from a DSL account. The foreign address, that is the origin of the SSH access to this account, is listed under foreign address. Netstat, with the argument numeric ports, will deliver, rather than the name of the protocol SSH, it'll deliver it in a numeric format. We come back up and we see rather than 172.30.0.223 as the local address followed by SSH, which is the protocol that was open and available, it actually displays it as 22, which is the port SSH will use to access an SSH session by default. You might, by the way, want to change the port SSH sessions are allowed to connect to some number, a higher number 55,223 or something like that, that provides a level of security through obscurity, whereas any hacker knows that people are often going to come into a system by SSH through port 22. It takes a particularly lucky hacker to figure out that it's actually port number 55,223. That's an option that you have. In the meantime, though, netstat tells us that this port 22 is open and that it's accepting an SSH session currently from this address. Netstat, with the argument NTLP, will display all open ports, whether they're active or not. And it'll tell us a little more information about what's accessible through this open port. For instance, under the port 22, which of course is the SSH port, it gives us an IP of 0.0.0.0. What is the significance of that IP, which obviously doesn't really exist? It's telling us that any IP anywhere on the internet will have open access. If the access to port 22 is restricted to a particular IP, it would output that IP. But as it's 0.0.0.0, you know that anybody who happens to have a password, an appropriate password, and knows about this IP address and that 22 is open, can access it. You may be happy with that. It's quite a common setting. Or you may not be happy with it, but at least netstat tells you where you stand. One other important tool that you can add to your netstat arsenal is grep. Now, of course, the vertical line is achieved by hitting shift and backslash at the same time, and then following with grep. Grep will narrow down the output of the netstat command. In our case, because there are so few ports open and so little activity actually happening on this account, it's not really that useful. But you could, for instance, single out, if you had a lot of output you wanted to work through, you might single out the word listen, so that only those ports that are open for listening would actually display.